Marriage is clearly an evolutionary elaboration on something that in another creature we would call mate guarding. Mate guarding is a situation in which one of the mates, typically the male, follows the female around to ensure that her progeny is produced by him. In human beings, this has been augmented tremendously to add all sorts of depth and symmetry to the mate guarding. And in fact, it looks much closer in many ways to something like what we might see in other monogamous primates. In monogamous primates, individuals will sit together and they will actually duet. I believe this is true for all monogamous primates other than human beings, that the male and the female will gather repeatedly and they will sit on the same branch and sing together. So I'm not saying that never happens in humans, but it's not an obligate behavior in humans, whereas it is an obligate behavior in teddy monkeys and gibbons and other monogamous primates. The important thing to realize, though, is that once you have a structure like mate guarding, and then it begins to be elaborated for other purposes, that all sorts of stuff gets built into that relationship. And so there's obviously a very intensive kind of reciprocation within the marital context, where males and females are contributing in many ways equally, though not the same things, to the relationship. And so they're both providing for what ultimately is the basis for family. That's what the purpose of these bonds originally was. And it's not something that has to be maintained. We could repurpose marital relationships for things other than producing offspring, but that is ultimately why the relationship evolved. In fact, most human societies have almost certainly not been monogamous, and you can see in the small but measurable bit of size dimorphism in human males and human females that there has been some history of non-monogamy. That said, most people on Earth today derive from populations that are at least nominally monogamous, which begins to tell an interesting tale. The different mating systems that we have monogamy, one male and one female bonded together. We have polygyny, which is a male and multiple females. We have polyandry, which is one female and multiple males. And we have promiscuity, which is multiple males and multiple females. Monogamy is the most common system on Earth today. Polygyny would be the second most common, and historically probably the most common, mild polygyny. Polyandry is exceedingly rare, though there are circumstances where human beings end up in a polyandrous situation where a female will have multiple husbands. Interestingly, those cases all seem to involve brothers marrying the same woman, which reduces the cost to those males genetically of having another male father children with their wife. And then there's promiscuity, which probably has been exceedingly rare in human history, but is essentially the basis for what is now being called polyamory, and people are experimenting with this mode. Whether that makes sense is an interesting question, but it is certainly something people are interested in at the moment. Each of these mating systems are evolutionary responses to particular kinds of conditions. There are virtually no conditions in which promiscuity makes sense, and the reason for that is that human babies are extremely needy, and because they're extremely needy, females are absolutely required to care for them. Pregnancy and nursing are both very labor intensive, and so females are incapable of having a low investment relationship with offspring, and that means that they have every reason to be exceedingly choosy about with whom they mate, and one of the things that they are most choosy about is evidence that a male will stick around and invest in these very needy offspring. So promiscuity is pretty rare for that reason. Polyandry is pretty rare because males are selected to avoid letting other males mate with their pair-bonded females, because the evolutionary cost of raising another man's offspring is so high. So doing so when the other male is a brother reduces that cost by 50%. Still, we only see it in circumstances where the habitat is so marginal that two individuals have trouble producing enough labor to raise children successfully, and they need a third that does not increase the number of babies produced. So that would have to be a male rather than a female. Monogamy, I would argue, evolves when you have non-zero-sum dynamics, like a new continent or something that a population is going to spread across, and producing new individuals at the highest rate is favored in order to capture that entire new territory. Monogamy is advantageous because it brings every adult into child rearing, and the limit on the number of babies produced has a lot to do with the amount that is being invested in taking care of new offspring. So raising them and getting them fed and then allowing females to move on to their next offspring is prioritized in circumstance where there's new territory to fill with people, and so it selects for monogamy. So I would argue that the reason that human populations have shifted in recent millennia in the direction of monogamy has to do with the fact that it was also an age in which lots of land masses that were either underexploited or that were inhabited by people who did not have the technology to defend them resulted in populations moving into those places and spreading across them. I'm not sure that this answer actually requires us to specify which version of marriage we're talking about. Really, the point is you have a bond between two people, and the fact that one of those people may have a bond with somebody else doesn't say anything one way or the other about the bond that they have. So let's talk about monogamy because it's the simplest case, but I don't think it's a limited answer. The terminology that surrounds marriage actually gives us an indication about what kind of relationship this is, and I'm always shocked that we never discuss the implications because they're right in front of us. When you marry somebody, their siblings become your siblings-in-law. Their parents become your parents-in-law. You are stepping into what is effectively a sibling relationship. And in fact, marriage has a lot in common with a regular sibling relationship. Marriages, in spite of the mythology that often surrounds them, are extremely complicated relationships, and there is tension and there's a lot of richness to them in much the same way that there is a sibling relationship. And the reason for that is pretty obvious, which is just like siblings, spouses have real things at stake, and their interests are not 100% overlapping. They are greatly overlapping, but there's some divergence. And so what that results in is real tension over things that matter. And anybody who goes into marriage thinking that it's going to be like a fairy tale has another thing coming to them. That, I think, results in us making an error, which is people, because they have the wrong idea about what a functional marriage is supposed to look like, if they run into those tensions, they often imagine that that is either the result of them failing to do it well or the result of the fact that the entire idea of marriage is bogus to begin with. Well, in fact, our terminology surrounding how one finds themselves married under modern circumstances where you're not set up in a marriage by your parents or something, the terminology is very confusing to begin with, because when somebody is smitten in the extreme, we say that they've fallen in love. And the state that they are in, that deep infatuation, is in many ways a profoundly dishonest state, and one that may give way to real love, or it may not. But that state appears designed to cause a person to act in an unsustainable way that is better than their normal self. And effectively, it allows a person to mislead another person into believing better of them than would be fair. And when two people fall in love with each other, they're both sort of actively lying about who they really are. It's not intentional, it's not conscious, but the infatuated state is temporary, unsustainable, and not accurate with respect to how a person is actually going to be in the long term. When that state wears off, one finds out if the relationship that remains behind is actually one of true love, and the nature of that true love relationship is actually truly giving. It doesn't really work. A marriage is not going to function. It can last, but it won't function well if people do not view each other as similarly important to self. In other words, there's something inherently selfless about a state of true love, and that is not the nature of infatuation. Infatuation is almost the opposite state. I don't want to represent love as completely selfless. A person does not surrender their entire self inside of a loving relationship. But what they effectively do is they put their partner on a level playing field. That is to say, they will genuinely sacrifice for the well-being of their partner, and the partner will do the same. And that is what I would call true love, which I wouldn't say is in contrast to romantic love. I think that is romantic love. What it isn't is infatuation. Infatuation is the very early, unsustainable state. And what I'm calling true love is almost by definition a sustainable state. It's something that can last and grow and can govern the way a relationship functions. But the way to think of it does involve basically, instead of thinking of selflessness, it is at least equally good to say that it is a broadening of the concept of self to include another and then to include offspring. And that's what it feels like too. Well, in a traditional circumstance, first of all, we should be a little bit careful. There is a legal construct that we call marriage, and then there's a pair bond that is meant to be indefinite. And they don't necessarily overlap. There are lots of places where people may not have the money to get legally married, but they sign up for the informal contract nonetheless. What would have been true until birth control is that reproductive behavior would have, in most circumstances, waited until that contract was nailed down, until people had agreed to be together. And the reason for that is that females have everything to lose if they sign up for such an agreement informally. They go to bed, get fertilized, and then the guy runs off. That's such a great deal for a male, evolutionarily speaking, and such a terrible deal for a woman, evolutionarily speaking, that essentially all of our courtship rituals are built around unearthing that false desire to procreate. So falling in love would have been accompanied by intense desire, and it might have resulted in a decision to marry in order to be able to have sex. But agreeing to have sex because you're in a promising relationship that might result in marriage doesn't make any sense, because actually the incentives for males work exactly the other way. At the point that a woman has become pregnant without nailing down the requirement of commitment, the guy might actually be favored to leave because that's a freebie, and he can go start another family and invest the resources that would have gone to that woman and her offspring in somebody else. We tend to have the sense that marriage requires something special in order for it to evolve. And in fact, that's the opposite of the case. In birds, something like 85% are monogamous in some form that we recognize, either within a season or across a lifetime. In mammals, it's less than 15%. Why the difference? Well, it comes down to something physiological, which interrupts the value of monogamy within mammals. Teaming up to raise offspring that require a lot of investment is very valuable and increases the chances of those offspring being successful. What gets in the way is that in mammals, males have a high likelihood of being uncertain of their paternity. That because of the way mammals reproduce, because of internal gestation, Males don't necessarily know when a female that they have mated with gives birth, whether the offspring that she just gave birth to is theirs or not. And so selection favors them not to invest in offspring that they are uncertain of the paternity of. And so it is harder for monogamy to evolve. In birds, the eggs are fertilized right before they're laid. So the amount of time that a male has to be able to account for a female's whereabouts is much shorter in order for him to know that the offspring is his. And so monogamy readily evolves. So what this means is that there's an advantage to these intensive pair bonds. The advantage is it allows the raising of children that are better cared for, which then allows for the evolution of what we call altriciality, helplessness in the young. Helplessness is not in and of itself a good thing, but the ability to be helpless and be cared for by two parents allows the evolution of high degrees of behavioral complexity, and so it has advantages. And what this really suggests is that yes, pair bonding is valuable in many circumstances, and the universe keeps telling us that by producing it in different taxa that aren't related to each other. And marriage is this elaboration of these pair bonds in the context of a creature that picks up most of what it is behaviorally as a software update after it's born. And so the idea of parents who have this repository of humanness that they carry around in their minds rather than their genomes, and then they pass on to offspring in a way that can be augmented and modified for changes in circumstance or new discoveries, that is an amazingly powerful phenomenon. And it is not in any way incidental. Human beings are all about the software. Monogamous pair bonds that raise offspring are all about transmitting that software to the next generation, and two parents raising children together is the ideal way for that to work. So there are many asymmetries between men and women if we look at what they would have been like in ancestral circumstances. And I'm an advocate for the idea that all of these things can be opened up, and we can decide some of these asymmetries may not be desirable. We shouldn't want to perpetuate them into the future. Some of them may be desirable, but we want to democratize the contents, and we may want to take stuff that's traditionally masculine and make it available to everybody, and likewise some of the stuff that's feminine, we may want to make it available to everybody. In general, I would say that there is a dichotomy between males and females under ancestral circumstances that comes from the fact that females are much lower variance than males with respect to how many offspring they can produce. Females are limited by the rate at which they can get pregnant, nurse a child to wean it, and then get pregnant again. And so that puts a relatively low limit on the number of offspring that can be produced in a lifetime. A man, if he is having sex without commitment, can produce an indefinitely large number of offspring in a lifetime. So that high variance versus low variance distinction has all kinds of implications for the way men and women have traditionally viewed the world, and I think it results in essentially two different toolkits of wisdom that have traveled through humanity's past. One of them has traveled a female path. That would be a kind of far-sighted wisdom that comes closer to matching the well-being of the population at large, because a female can't get lucky and produce 100 offspring in a lifetime. Her fitness is largely a matter of how well her population persists through time, and therefore how good a home it provides for whatever offspring she produces. Males, because they're high variance, are much more likely to have wisdom about high risk, high reward activities. And if we think about some of the things that men are traditionally imagined to be involved in, stuff like getting on a ship and going over the horizon to see what's over there, it's a very dangerous behavior. And most of the men who did that probably didn't come back. But those who did came back sometimes came back big winners. And so that high risk, high reward kind of wisdom is likely to have traveled a male path. There's no reason, though, that these kinds of wisdom can't be made general, that a woman who wants to get involved in high-risk, high-reward activities should have access to that wisdom too. But we shouldn't necessarily imagine that everybody will just pick it up automatically. The nature of wisdom is that actually it takes experience and exposure in order to discover it. And so whatever it is that teaches men how to think in this way is something that probably needs to be available to everybody. Doesn't mean women will be inherently as interested in it. They may be, they may not be, but they should have access to it. And likewise, males should certainly have access to the toolkit of female wisdom, however it is that that's accumulated amongst women. Probably we would be in a lot better circumstance environmentally if men who have had an awful lot of say over how the world is governed had a long-term view about well-being rather than a very narrow, competitive short-term view. The story, the mythology surrounding oppression of females by a patriarchal force, that mythology causes a tragic miscalculation. Men have two reproductive strategies. One reproductive strategy I will call sow and go, that is, love them and leave them. That love them and leave them strategy would have been very rarely successful in the ancestral past because females are so thoroughly built and schooled to avoid allowing it to happen. The cost of raising an offspring alone is so high that females have done everything in their power to prevent this from occurring. Nonetheless, males are focused on it because when it happens, it's such an evolutionary bargain that it's a huge win. It's like a winning lottery ticket. So the commonality of it would have been low, but the value of it when it happened to an individual male would have been high. That causes males to always be on the lookout for this possibility. On the other hand, the way males would have typically reproduced inside of a society would have been to invest in a female, to pair bond with them and to invest in their offspring. And that's a lower variance strategy, but it is nonetheless the more common way of getting there. In that phase, looking for a mate in whom to invest for the long haul, males and females are much more similar. A male who's looking for a wife is much more like a female looking for a husband than a male looking to score. And so what this means is that males have these two phases, and one of them is randy and not very interesting. And somehow this mythology surrounding the oppressive patriarchy has led people to imagine that in order for women to be equal to men, they have to, quote unquote, behave like men. And to behave like men doesn't mean like behaving like men in their best phase. It means behaving like men in their most frivolous, stupid, and least reliable phase. So what we're effectively doing is, instead of having the virtues of masculinity be democratized so women have those things available to them, what we have is stupid male behavior being delivered to females as if it were the height of sophistication. And it's resulting in a dysfunctional society in which nothing seems to work. And, we're talking about new rules for sexuality in which one constantly needs to seek, the reestablishment of consent or whatever it is. And it's just not very healthy. There is a way in which males in a culture with healthy masculinity mature into an ability to do extraordinary things, to stay cool under fire, all sorts of things like that. And those are highly desirable characteristics. By synonymizing maleness with aggro, getting lucky, stuff, we destroy the high quality version of masculinity and we put in its place a low quality version of masculinity. And frankly, the female analog, this masculinity that is unleashed, the superhero female that you're talking about, is a fiction, right? It doesn't really work. And I would say the women who I know who have these maybe traditionally masculine characteristics who really pull it off, who are really super capable, and who you would want to have on your team under terrible circumstances. It looks much more like a traditional masculinity than it does like some modern made-up version.
So you said there's the two evolutionary strategies. There's sow and go.
Yeah.
Would the other one be stay and pay?
That's a terrible way to put it, but yes. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, this exists in the mythology too, right? Men sow their wild oats, and then they settle down. Now, settling down makes it sound awful. But really what they do is they wise up. Yeah. I had a mentor when I was in graduate school. Very interesting guy. Very one-off kind of guy who had certain kinds of wisdom. And he used to talk about the difference in men after their libido stopped jerking them around. And his basic point was it's very hard to concentrate when your libido, is pointing you this way and that way. And that when that lets you go, suddenly you have access to your full mental faculties to point at problems that are actually worthy of your attention.
You still have that driving masculine force, but now you get to concentrate it on a building or a larger project or a family or something like that.
Totally.
Fair to say.
Yeah. You get to actually get to be a man, I guess.
Huh.
There's a lot of discussion in society about whether or not monogamy is a problem to be solved. In other words, if it is some kind of puritanical instinct that is holding us back from what we really are biologically. This is nonsense. Monogamy is an evolved state, and it has served the populations that most of us come from very well. Do we need to maintain it? I can't say for sure. I can say that the alternative that people are advancing, polyamory, is not likely to be stable, and it is almost certainly going to devolve into polygyny. That in a state where people are lowering the bar to mating, what ultimately happens is those people who are powerful, those men who are powerful, end up accumulating many mates, and many men get frozen out by the fact that they're lower status. When that happens, you produce a situation that is not healthy for society. Whether individuals choose to do this or not, civilization has a lot to lose if it's creating sexually frustrated males. Those males ultimately become armies. Somebody decides to arm them and point them at some population that can't defend themselves, or they become violent. So there's a lot to be said from society's perspective for monogamy being the state that is the best, that is the most compatible with the values that we all share. There's also a lot to be said for the fact that from an individual point of view, it is also the most rewarding state, that people fantasize, just as people sometimes vote as if they were very, very wealthy when they're not. They imagine that they might become wealthy. When we talk about what sorts of mating systems make sense, people probably imagine that they're going to be on the winning end of it. And to the extent that women are evolutionarily set up to evaluate different mating opportunities in particular ways, they are liable to find what actually evolves in a polyamorous situation disappointing, and men are liable to find out that unless they're at the top of the hierarchy, it isn't very satisfying either. So if our real point is individual human satisfaction in the context of sex, love, and romance, monogamy is the way to go. In addition to the benefits it provides of just being safer for civilization. What I think probably would be surprising to people is that because monogamy has a relatively long history in human beings, that the difficulty of behaving in a monogamous way is not zero, but it is less than people imagine. When people sign up for a monogamous relationship, there's a certain terror about it that comes from the way comics talk about it, and comes from the sorts of things, said around the campfire. But the fact is, because monogamy has been highly successful at allowing people to produce offspring and raise them, to team up, there is effectively a program for behaving monogamously inside of human beings, yes, even human males. And that the discovery that it is not the struggle that you think it's going to be, because in fact, if you look for it, the wiring is there, would probably be a relief to a lot of people who spend a tremendous amount of effort imagining that they're going to get trapped in something that's torture.